Welcome back to another console collector video.
Let's kick off part 3 with the Sega Genesis.
Next up, we take a look at a console from 1989, the Sega Genesis. Its original retail price was $189 US. Adjusted for inflation, that would be $392 today. The Sega Genesis is a 16-bit home video game console developed and sold by Sega. The Genesis was Sega's successor to the Master System. Sega released the console in North America in 1989. The Genesis had several add-ons during its long run, including the Power Base Converter, which allowed you to play Sega Master System games on your Sega Genesis. That's this thing here. Basically, you just plop it in the top cartridge port of your Sega Genesis right here, and you are good to go. You are playing Master System games on your Sega Genesis. The Genesis Model 1, which you see here, was the launch model. The Genesis Model 2 is the most iconic and most recognizable version of the Genesis. And the Genesis Model 3 was the smallest and most basic version of the Genesis. So this is the Model 1. Pretty slick looking unit. Has a volume control here, headphone port, reset on and off. Basically, you just take your cartridge, pop it in the slot. You were playing Sega Genesis. As you can see here, it says 16-bit. This kind of started the whole bit wars kind of deal. 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit, 64-bit. Yeah, the bit wars. So that's the Genesis Model 1. Then you have the Genesis Model 2, which again, this is the most iconic and recognizable Genesis. Most common. This is the one that pretty much everybody had. They got rid of the volume control and headphone port, so you just got your basic two controller ports, power, reset, cartridge slot. That's the Genesis 2. Then they released the budget version here, the Genesis Model 3, which is a bare bones basic unit. You got your reset, your power, your cartridge slot, and controller ports. Really slimmed down in comparison to the Genesis Model 2. It's very small, and even more so to the Genesis Model 1. This thing could fit basically right here. So very small, very cheap budget kind of system. Not so cheap anymore. The Sega Genesis had a CD add-on called the Sega CD. It also had a 32-bit add-on, the Sega 32X. The Sega CD launched at $299 US with adjusting for today's inflation, that would be $549, and the 32X was $159, adjusted with inflation is $273. So that's the Sega CD there in the back, and then this is the Sega 32X. With the Genesis, the Sega CD, and the 32X all together, the console became a monstrosity that was bulky and needed several AV cables and 3 different bulky power supplies. So altogether, this is the Sega Genesis Model 2, the 32X, and the Sega CD. This thing is large, bulky, it's huge. It needs so many cables in the back. As you can see, the 32X is kind of this mushroom top. It literally just plops inside of your Genesis 2 cartridge port. And then the Sega CD is a giant, huge base here on the bottom that the Genesis 2 slides into. And you put your disc base game there. What a beast. Sega also created a network service to support the Genesis. That is known as the Sega Channel. That's this little unit here. Basically, you would take your Genesis Model 2, you would stick this right in the top there, you'd connect your cable here, and then power outlet there. Something about Sega in general, everything needed its own power supply. It's crazy. Kind of got a similar look to the 32X. So the Sega Channel, to sum it up, was an on-demand type of service that allowed you to play digital games over the internet. It was way ahead of its time. It was similar to Netflix to help you understand how it worked. Just pick a game from a big list and play.
Fight.
With the popularity of Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog series and several popular sports franchises, along with the aggressive youth marketing that positioned the system as the cool console for the youth, which helped the Genesis get a foothold in the video game market share that Nintendo was dominating at the time. The release of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System 2 years after the Genesis resulted in a fierce battle for market share in the United States that basically kicked off the infamous console war. As this contest drew increasing attention to the video game industry among the general public, the Genesis and several of its high-profile games attracted significant legal scrutiny on matters involving reverse engineering and video game violence. Controversy surrounding violent games such as Night Trap and Mortal Kombat led to Sega to create the Video Game Rating Council, a predecessor to the Entertainment Software Rating Board, the ESRB as it's known today. So next time you see that little rating on a new game you're buying, remember, it all started back in the 90s with the Sega Genesis. Later on in the Genesis lifespan, Sega released a hybrid system called the Sega CDX, which was a small console that was a Genesis and a Sega CD all-in-one. It was so small, in fact, that it was marketed as a portable CD player. So this is the Sega CDX. You got your Genesis cartridge port up top here. Pop that open, you can put in your Sega CD game or your audio CD. Has the forward, back, pause, stop, standard CD controls, reset, power, controller ports, AV out, power supply, line out, your volume control, and headphones. Pretty crazy to think that this rare and expensive console would be used as a portable CD player back in the day. Definitely won't be doing that now. There are a number of third-party companies that released their own versions of the Sega Genesis, such as the JVC Wonder Mega, which was a large Sega CD and Genesis combo system, and the Pioneer Laser Active, which was a Genesis and a Laserdisc player. Finally, the Sega Genesis also got the classic treatment over the last few years with several emulation-style consoles with built-in games similar to the NES and SNES Classic. They are commonly known to be made of lower quality and have poor emulation on most of the classic systems based on the Sega Genesis. The Sega Genesis is a huge part of video game history, with lots of ups and downs, and they are a great example of how a small guy can take on the big guy and be successful. However, they also proved that you're not invincible and sometimes you just need to know when to quit. The Genesis originally launched with a 3-button controller and later on a 6-button controller. The Genesis used cartridge-based media as well as the 32X. The Sega CD used disc-based media. The Genesis was home to a number of classic games such as Sonic the Hedgehog, Streets of Rage, and Mortal Kombat. The rarest Sega Genesis game is Crusader of Senti. The bestseller was Sonic 1, and the final release for the Genesis was Frogger. The rare Sega CD game is Snatcher, The best-selling Sega CD game was Sonic CD, and its final game released for the Sega CD was Wirehead. And in closing, the rare Sega 32X game is Spider-Man Web of Fire. The bestseller for the 32X was Doom, and the last game released on the 32X is also the rarest game on the 32X, Spider-Man Web of Fire. So real quick, this is the 3-button controller that the Genesis launched with. ABC buttons start, and your directional pad. Pretty standard looking controller, other than this shape here, it's kind of looped. Now, as you've seen earlier, this is a standard Genesis cartridge, black, got an end label, it's got stamping on the back there. Just another version here of this Castlevania standard Genesis cart. This here is a 32X cart, so it's a little bit different overall design and shape. No end label. So Sega on the back. Pretty much the same size, just not the exact same. This here is a Sega CD case. It basically came in a long case, and it's just a disc inside. That was Jurassic Park. The Saturn ended up using long cases like that, which you'll see later on. And then the 32X also had Sega CD games, so kind of like you needed the 32X and the Sega CD to play Night Trap, which was this like interesting cardboard, kind of really soft case, and it would come in just like so. So lots of different variations for games on the Sega Genesis. Alright, that's going to wrap up the iconic Sega Genesis. Up next is the Console Wars underdog, the TurboGrafx 16 from 1989. Its original retail price was $249 US. Adjusted for inflation, that's $516 US. The NEC TurboGrafx 16, better known as the PC Engine, worldwide was released in the United States in August 1989. It was the first home console released in the 16-bit era. Originally intended to compete with the NES, it ended up competing with the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. It was one of the many consoles in the console wars. The TurboGrafx 16 was unique because it stored games on a special HUE card, opposed to cartridges that were seen in other consoles at the time. The TurboGrafx 16 failed to break into the North American market and sold fairly poorly, which has been blamed on less than successful marketing. Despite the 16 in its name and the marketing of the console as a 16-bit console, it used an 8-bit CPU, a marketing tactic that was seen as deceptive by some. So this here is the TurboGrafx 16. You got your power slot here, single controller port. There was only one controller port for the TurboGrafx 16, so you basically had to buy a multi-tap to play anything multiplayer. On the side here you got your standard like RF out, channel 2 and 3, power supply. This guy here is an expansion port. There are several things that worked with that expansion port, including this little piece here. This is the Turbo Booster Plus. Essentially it gave you RCA output, which was much better than the RF output at the time. So you would basically take this, see there, plug it into there, and bada bing. The console's larger, but now you have beautiful RCA coaxial output. But there's more that port did than just that. These things here are the HUE cards, or the games. Basically as thin as like a credit card. You take your game, You would insert it into this slot here, power on, like so, and you were ready to rock and roll. The cases here, seen in Darkwing Duck, basically had a special little square here and a clip that held the game in place. One thing to quickly note about the TurboGrafx was it actually had its own magazine called TurboPlay, similar to Nintendo Power or PlayStation Magazine. Yeah, it was basically a subscription-based magazine that was about everything about the TurboGrafx. So later on, in 1989, NEC released a CD add-on for the TurboGrafx 16 that retailed for $399 US. That's $827 US adjusted for inflation. That was one expensive add-on. While it had little impact on the ailing TurboGrafx 16 in North America, the add-on boosted PC Engine sales in Japan. The CD add-on needed a special hue card inserted into the card slot to act as a boot card for the CD drive to function. The CD add-on was 2 additional pieces and they were large and bulky. The TurboGrafx CD add-on was one of the first home consoles to feature CD-based games. So this here is the TurboGrafx CD add-on. It can actually be used as a portable CD player, which is crazy. Why would you spend that much money on that? But you got a headphone in there. Got your volume here, and then just some ports here. So how does this little guy fit onto this? Well, it's that expansion port I just showed you. This monstrosity here is the TurboGrafx CD dock. It's big, bulky, kind of heavy. Basically what you would do would take your TurboGrafx console here, slide it into place like so. Then you would take your CD add-on and slide it on like so. And with that, you had the TurboGrafx 16 and Turbo CD all in one. Definitely looks better than some other console add-ons slapped together. Genesis, Atari Jaguar, just to name a few. This here is the special TurboGrafx 16 CD system card. You needed this card to get the Turbo CDs to work. So you'd slide it into the card slot like so, and then you would open up that, pop in your CD, you're ready to rock and roll. So in 1992, the Turbo Duo was released in North America. It was the American version of the PC Engine Duo, a Japanese game console released in 1991. It essentially was a TurboGrafx 16 and Turbo CD all built into one system. The system used a rectangle controller similar to the NES with built-in turbo switches. So, slide him out of the way. This guy over here is the Turbo Duo and PC Engine Duo. Again, it's basically a TurboGrafx 16 and Turbo CD all into one convenient package. So you lifted up your slot here, and you'd slide in your hue card. What's nice about the Turbo Duo is technical difficulties. You put the game in and you close the flap, and it's actually protected. It's not just sitting out in the open. And then of course the other side is your CD drive. So this side on the right, it basically is the Turbo CD, and then this side here is the TurboGrafx 16. Again, only one controller input. Then you got volume and a headphone jack on there, power. Definitely the way to go if you want to play Turbo CD and TurboGrafx games. Basically anything NEC Turbo is very expensive, so take your pick. As for the controller, This is the controller used, called the Turbo Pad. They basically called everything Turbo. Turbo Cap, Turbo Pad, Turbo Express, Turbo Graphics, everything was Turbo. So what's cool here is you basically have your directional pad, your start select, and your A and B or 1 and 2 buttons, but these were built-in turbo controllers, so you could set your turbo speed. Hence the name, Turbo Graphics. In closing, the TurboGrafx 16 was home to great games like Bonk's Adventure, R-Type, Legendary Axe, and Splatterhouse. The rarest hue card for the TurboGrafx is Magical Chase. That is one expensive video game. I believe the last few have been in the $3,000 to $4,000 price range, just for the little hue card. $3 to $4 grand for this guy. It's over $10,000, I believe, for a complete copy. The best seller on the game was the packing game, Keith's Courage. And the final hue card released for the TurboGrafx 16 was Beyond Shadow Gate. So that's the TurboGrafx 16. Alright, that's the end of part 3. Stay tuned to part 4. We'll kick it off with the mighty Neo Geo AES.